City romped to a 3-0 win against their Manchester rivals, thanks to a double by Haaland and a late Foden goal. City were dominant in the end, but early on, things were looking competitive for United. So what did we see tactically from Guardiola and Ten Hag? Let's take a look, beginning with City on the ball. And initially in possession, City were taking unreasonable risks. As we've become accustomed to, City's back four in possession is actually a back three, with Stones moving up as a pivot alongside Rodri and Alvarez and Silva staying higher up the pitch. But where usually when City switch into this back three, they were much more conservative, allowing them to be safer against the transition, in this match they were hyper aggressive, keeping both Walker and Gvardiol extremely wide even early in the build-up play. In fact, they were so wide it often looked like City were building up with one centre-back and two traditional full-backs, leaving massive gaps between Diaz and both Walker and Gvardiol. And knowing that City liked to dominate the centre, United were looking to protect it as much as possible, with Amrabat looking to tie up Alvarez high up in the right-hand half space and almost looking man-to-man at times, whilst Eriksen would pick up the second pivot. McTominay was tasked with staying tight on Rodri, and we also saw Rashford, and more importantly Fernandes, look to tuck in as much as they could to ensure that none of the box midfield were free during the build-up phase. What this meant is, with City being uncharacteristically sloppy early on in the build-up phases, if there was a turnover, there were massive gaps for the likes of Højlund and Rashford to attack on the counter-attack, and we saw United getting into these deadly positions time and again, but they just couldn't find the right pass. Or if they did, their forwards were unable to pull the trigger in time, meaning that United did not make the most of the occasions when City were looking extremely vulnerable. Guardiola soon adapted, and instead of tucking in his centre-backs as to be expected, he instead switched to a 4 during the build-up phase, either with Stones dropping in, but more often it was Rodri who would drop in from pivot while Stones remained higher up the pitch, meaning that there were no longer those massive gaps potentially on the transition. And with McTominay often being man-oriented on Rodri, when he was pulled out, it also created more space in the centre of the pitch for City to try and pick up the ball. But whether City were building up with the back four or the back three, there was a method to their madness by looking to keep Walker and Gvardiol so wide. Ten Hag wanted his wingers, and Fernandes in particular, to remain narrow to prevent that overload through the centre. However, City's shape would force United to make decisions. The obvious outlets were out wide, and when we saw Gvardiol get onto the ball, it often meant that Fernandes was drawn out of position. And we did see Silva starting out higher up in the half space, but as the game progressed, he occupied this region, almost as a pseudo left back as much as possible, while Stones was often providing an option, so that now there was the potential to outnumber United in this position. When Silva was in this position, Dalot would be reluctant to press because it would mean Grealish could potentially receive the ball and begin to disrupt the United backline. If the defensive midfielder in Eriksen, who is not the most mobile, looked to follow Silva deep, there was room that was created, and Alvarez was not stuck in this right-hand half space and he could move into this region, or it would open up the opportunity for some combination play from City. Eriksen coming out to press would also be made much more complicated, as Grealish tended to tuck infield into this zone of uncertainty when Bernardo Silva was dropping deeper, both drawing in Dalot, whilst Eriksen would have one eye on him. And Silva would often shift all the way out wide to a left winger position, again making it much harder for Eriksen to commit to pressing him in this region due to the room that he would be leaving. And we would see a lot of rotation between Grealish and Silva. Either way, Eriksen is not a natural defensive midfielder and is not the most physical, so he would struggle to keep up with the half-space runs when they did come. So City were able to time and again penetrate United's right-hand side, and as we often see, Haaland would look to pull to the back post to try win the header. In fact, United's halftime change saw Mount coming on in the attacking midfield position, allowing McTominay to drop deeper to this right-hand side. The first potential advantage would have been having Mount's creativity rather than McTominay receiving between the lines, especially on the transition. But also on the defensive end of things, McTominay has an incredible engine and could track his man all day long if United were appropriately positioned. But things weren't always so easy, as if City were able to break this first line of pressure from United, it would still mean that McTominay would be drawn to a man on the ball, again seeing that overload on the left hand side and the 2 versus 1 against Dalot. Or even if City did not break that first line of pressure and Gvardiol got onto the ball, if both Grealish and Silva were unavailable, he was more than willing to look to push high up the pitch and now create a 3 versus 2 instead of the previously discussed 2 versus 1. And still open up potential opportunities for City to get into dangerous zones. And this is something that United just never came to grips with. And United did not have much of the ball, but what was their game plan early on? While City were looking to defend in a 4-4-2 as we often see, and although they weren't too aggressive in the press, this would still have meant the potential for a man-to-man press against the centre-backs. So in order to counteract this, we saw Onana being hyper-aggressive in the build-up play, pushing up to become the third centre-back, whilst Evans and Maguire would split either side of him. If this was one of the occasions when City were looking to push up high and back up the press, the 4-4-2 meant they were naturally 3 versus 2 down, so Onana could look to split the midfield directly and get United playing between the lines. But we also saw them have a lot of success going directly to Højlund, who would then knock down the ball to the man between the lines, and now all of a sudden, City's press, and more importantly their midfield, had been bypassed, giving United the opportunity to push higher up the pitch. And City were already naturally 3 versus 2 down in this 4-4-2 shape, and this would often be made worse with Fernandes tucking in whilst Dalot provided the width down the right hand side. So they had to find a way to adapt to. This was by changing the configuration of their 4-4-2, and Haaland often wouldn't be joining high up in the press, but instead his role was to use his cover shadow to prevent the ball into one of the pivots so that he was effectively operating as an additional midfielder in the defensive phase. Alvarez was much more likely to keep pressing the man on the ball, but to prevent United building up too easily, Grealish would push up from his left wing position onto the secondary centre back. And Bernardo Silva, in this deeper role, would be tasked with operating in this position, halfway between Fernandes and either Dalot or Maguire if he was pushing higher up, with Pep explicitly asking him to play the role of 2 men in the defensive phase, which we know he can do with his great work rate. However, there were still occasions when Silva could be caught central and the ball out wide was on, or if he mistimed his press, the City midfield lines could be broken and United were once again in a decent position, but they never made the most of it in this match. Overall, United were wasteful with their early opportunities, and once City went ahead, the Reds crumbled, particularly in the second half. Pep's plan did not have to be perfect to secure the comfortable win, so he earns a 7, while Ten Hag's failure to adapt his shape effectively or make impactful changes means he only earns a 4. But what are your thoughts? Drop them down below. And if you like this, here are 2 perfect videos for you to watch next. One explaining what exactly is wrong with Ten Hag's United, and this mini documentary looking at how Mourinho ended Guardiola's reign at Barcelona. The choice is yours.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel.